Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another riveting episode of The Gold Standard with Alan Mosley. And take it away, Alan.
Wait, hold on. It's riveting now?
It's riveting.
You're building this up to a point.
I'm raising the bar. Look, I practiced in the mirror for like 3 weeks to get that down. I'm so happy I pulled it off.
Well, I practiced in the mirror for like 3 minutes before the show started. So joke's on you. You know what? This is the gold standard, and we've been away for a few days.
We've been away for a couple of days
because I was in New Orleans.
Yeah, I heard.
I know it was hot.
Man, I bet.
I was in New Orleans for the Take Human Action Bash.
Good.
That was
awesome.
hosted by the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus.
Good.
Which was a really awesome event.
Good.
Lots of really awesome speakers there.
Did you learn anything?
Oh no. They weren't communicating with enough cartoons and hand puppets.
See, that's what they'd have to do for me, because honestly, I'd be lost.
Well, I was just thinking to myself that, you know, if they had some interpretive dance, then maybe I would have got it.
That would have been hotter.
But let me tell you who would have been great at interpretive dance.
Who's that?
Is one of the excellent speakers who was there was the economist Robert Murphy.
All right.
And he is on the show with us today.
Awesome.
So Bob Murphy is a senior fellow with the Mises Institute and research assistant professor with the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University. He is the author of many books, including Choice, Cooperation, Enterprise, and Human Action, which is a modern distillation of the essentials of Mises' thought for the layperson. That's you and me.
Okay, yes.
He's also co-host with Tom Woods of the popular podcast Contra Krugman, which is a weekly refutation of Paul Krugman's New York Times column, which it's quickly becoming, don't tell Tom I said this, but Contra Krugman is quickly becoming my more favorite.
Okay.
Don't tell anybody I said that.
I won't tell anyone.
So, Bob Murphy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, and I just want to mention it's actually in my contract. I can only do interviews on shows that are riveting, so it's a good thing.
Well,
that you guys bumped that up. So.
Yeah, so before this week, this wouldn't have flown. But I'm going to show everybody at home some of the links that I have brought up real quick before we get into the to the meat of it. So we've got your website, which is consultingbyrpm.com, and so people can go there. They can see your clips of you, your writings, and maybe the best part is free advice from Robert Murphy.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
Consulting by Robert Murphy is where you go to free advice. So that's where people like you and me go, and we say, Bob, where should I invest my money for the next 30 years? And then he lays it out for us in a strategic plan.
In a way that we can hopefully understand.
Am I selling that right? Am I selling that right?
It's a bit. We'll be a bit open-ended on those details, but yeah.
Okay. You also have, I had the really good fortune of seeing you in Nashville. What was that, in April, I think it was? At a Mises Institute event that was in Nashville. Right. And you were there with Carlos Lara, who also spoke. And you guys actually have lauramurphy.com, Lara Murphy Reporting. And the two things I wanted to showcase to our viewers at home is, of course, there is the Lara Murphy Show, which is an awesome podcast as well. And then there's the Lara Murphy Report, which is an economic periodical that you. How often does Lara Murphy Report come out, Bob?
That's monthly.
That's monthly. So you have to be a subscriber. Not everything is free advice. You have to be a subscriber to the Lara Murphy Report.
Yeah, but there are a bunch of sample issues that are up if you go to lauramurphy.com. Yep. Yeah,
I'm showing that at people at home. So I don't want to show this for too long because I got to tell you, Bob, you're looking good in the camera window there. But at Lara Murphy, I'm seeing a faded, beardless Bob in the background. It almost looks like different people. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, I was young and naive back then.
Okay.
But yes.
Well, that's why Carlos is there to guide us steadily along. And then real quick, this is right now Bob's thinking, good Lord, this is just jumping around all over the place. But it wouldn't be the gold standard if we didn't just hop around all over the place. So I want to touch on choice later. I actually want to jump to the politically incorrect guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. That's in my library. I have read a book, Blake.
Okay.
I see you over there like, no, you haven't. I have read a book, and I have read the politically incorrect guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal, and that jumped out at me to speak of first today because, as you full well know, SCOTUS has been in the news. You know, the next Brett Kavanaugh. Trump's nominee for Supreme Court and all the back and forth of, this is going to be the next well-connected lawyer that runs our lives.
Yeah.
And right at the very beginning of your book, you're talking about FDR, and you're talking. I think right in chapter 1, you talk about his wanting to pack or threatening to pack the courts as one of the many things that you discuss in the book, Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. So I kind of want to start there. So I know you're an economist. Would you say that, or let me take that back. What would you say if you had to give like a 5-minute overview of what are the most critical pieces of history that we should be gleaning from the Great Depression and New Deal era, other than the aforementioned packing of the Supreme Court?
Well, sure. So, and just in case people don't know what that means, so it's that the Supreme Court originally struck down some of the early New Deal legislation, saying it's unconstitutional, might be a good idea, it might help you, but you don't have the authority to do this. And so then Roosevelt was saying, well, it's not clear how many justices there have to be on the Supreme Court, so maybe I'll appoint a bunch more. And then people realizing, whoa, that's going to lead to a huge constitutional crisis if the executive starts doing that. Mm-hmm. And so then the Supreme Court, all of a sudden, in its further rulings, was much more amenable to, the various New Deal legislation. So some people, we don't know what happened for sure. Obviously, we're not inside people's heads. But some people thought there was kind of an unspoken agreement that FDR backed off and said, okay, I won't try to add more justices to the court, but you guys better go along with the New Deal from this point forward. And then, maybe they agreed to do that. So that's an element, again, just showing, if Trump did something like that, people would absolutely flip out. And yet, that's what FDR did, as well as the, internment of Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. Again, literal concentration camps, obviously not as bad as what was happening, under in Germany and so forth, but nonetheless, things that it's odd that this hero of the left, who's supposed to be a champion of progressive causes, has some of these things associated with him. As far as just general history, so the huge one is this idea that Herbert Hoover was a laissez-faire ideologue, and the reason the U.S. plunged into the Great Depression was that, gosh darn it, back then people were very timid about the federal government intervening in the economy. And Hoover sat back and, played his fiddle while the economy sank into the, worst crisis ever. So if I could just take a second here, that doesn't make sense on many levels. So one thing is Hoover, in his memoirs, tries to say, hey, it wasn't my fault. I did more than any of my predecessors in terms of intervening and trying to help things. And he wasn't just saying that to cover his behind. Like, you can use data, and I put it in the book, showing that was the case, that Hoover, intervened more than anybody else who had prior to him. The other thing, too, is even the people advancing the thesis that Herbert Hoover was, did far too little, too late, and it was his unwillingness to intervene, even they can't with a straight face say that the prior presidents intervened more and Hoover rolled back, the big government or something. It's the idea was it wasn't until FDR that we finally got some sensible regulations on banking and, a willingness to intervene and have public works and so on. So even on their own terms, it doesn't make any sense. The question is, why did things get so bad in the early 1930s? There were plenty of depressions or financial panics, depression with a small d in U.S. history before then. How come they were all boom, bust, recovery pretty quick? They were painful, but they were pretty quick and you got it over with in a year or two. How come that happened? But how come it was with Hoover that we had this, agonizing thing? So it's like saying if a plane crashes and saying, oh, well, it's because of gravity. Well, yeah, that's obviously involved, but that doesn't explain why did that plane crash and not other ones. And so similar thing here, even on their own terms, it doesn't make sense to say, oh, yeah, under Hoover it was because he was unwilling to intervene. Because, again, that was true in U.S. history up to that point. In contrast, if Hoover was the most interventionist up to that point, then it does make sense to say, oh, maybe this is what changed. And so specifically to end the suspense, I know people are on the edge of their seats, it was the combination, I would say, that Hoover, among the other things he did, is he intervened strongly and called in all the big business leaders and said, don't let wages fall. Because Hoover subscribed to this theory that what happened in a bad recession was like a self-fulfilling prophecy or a downward spiral where businesses, their sales would plummet, and so then they would tighten their belts and lay off workers. Oh, but now people don't have wages, so they don't spend as much, and then it was just a downward spiral. Mm-hmm. So he thought, let's nip that in the bud. Businesses, keep your wages up, so the workers always have purchasing power. But back, they were on the gold standard, so if prices in general are plummeting, and this, we can get into if you want to, like the bank runs and stuff, how the money supply was shrinking. If prices in general are falling and businesses are not cutting nominal wage rates, then workers are becoming more and more expensive, mm-hmm. which is that's the worst thing to do. And so that's why unemployment shot up to 25%, was because workers were getting artificially expensive as the economy was collapsing. So in terms of, what was the one huge thing going on? So notice that has nothing to do with the laissez-faire Herbert Hoover. It was his desire to come in and help workers, in contrast, to his Neanderthal predecessors, that I would say really was the one thing that was the critical mistake that made unemployment shoot up so much.
Well, let me ask you this follow-up. So I definitely remember. I mean, I remember being in school, and so I grew up in the 90s, in the late 80s and 90s, and I remember being taught in school exactly that Herbert Hoover was basically a do-nothing president who sat back and watched the economy burn to the ground, and FDR came swooping in, and albeit not all of his actions were well received, but it was necessary. I think that's probably the pretty token public school line. Would you make the argument then that Herbert Hoover and then the transition to FDR, that was the furthest back, most significant change in the executive office trying to guide the economy, or would you say that there's an example further back than Herbert Hoover that really sort of tipped the scale into the favor of, well, the president is supposed to quote unquote run the economy?
I'm not sure this is answering your question. I think under Hoover, that was definitely the biggest leap in terms of peacetime intervention from the federal government in the guise of just helping the economy. And then the other one would be FDR up in the end of the New Deal. So it's possible during World War I or the Civil War, the federal, for sure, during World War I, the government, had all kinds of war industry boards and, cartelized mm-hmm. industries. But there, it was in the guise of fighting a war. It wasn't, to help with workers or unemployed people during a bad economy. So that was the distinction. Let
me use your words on this one then, because I want to smash one more topic before we move on to a different period or subject matter. Now, you just specifically emphasized the word peacetime, and so I know why you would do that. So there's obviously a difference in how the federal government generally runs the economy during peace versus the justifications of wartime that get used in order to enact policy that they otherwise wouldn't or could not popularly enact. So I think the other token line that you hear people say all the time is that, well, World War II got us out of the Depression. That's what you always hear. FDR and the New Deal and World War II, that got us. Even if the New Deal wasn't going to get us out, thank goodness World War II happened, because all that destruction and murder, that helps us get out of the Depression. So I want you to take a few minutes to emphasize where that thought comes from and why it's wrong.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because earlier you said you wanted me to list a bunch of the popular misconceptions. That's clearly right up there. Yes. And but I didn't want to be talking for half an hour without letting you respond. So that's why I stopped. So yes, that's a huge one. And so one point is, I notice a lot of right wingers or people who probably might call themselves conservatives even, will say something like, "Oh yeah, it wasn't the New Deal that got us out of the Depression; it was World War II." Mm-hmm. And they think they're being, they're standing up for conservatism and American mother pie and apple pie, or motherhood and apple pie. And the thing is, though, that's admitting the Keynesians are right. You're saying, oh, okay, yeah, maybe it wasn't wage fixing and cartelization, but you're saying the big spending on tanks and bombers and stuff is ultimately what pulled the U.S. out of the Depression. So you agree with Paul Krugman, big government spending cures the Depression, right? So notice that that's not really refuting left-wingers. That's just quibbling over the details and the magnitude. So, so that's just one, rhetorical point. But more concretely and specifically, so the reason prima facie it seems like that's plausible is if you look at the standard statistics, it's true. Unemployment was really high. It did come down a little bit when FDR first. So FDR wins the 32 election. He's inaugurated in early 33. Mm-hmm. Unemployment peaked, in late 30. I think 19. An annual average is 32. So it starts coming down under FDR, but then it shoots up again like at 37, 38. And so even by the end of the 1939, the U.S. is still clearly in a bad economy. The Depression is still going on. And it was not until the mobilization and the draft that you saw the official unemployment figures come down. Similar story with the official GDP figures. It was very lackluster throughout the 30s, and it was not until the big wartime spending that you saw the official GDP numbers start rising rapidly. So that's where this idea comes from that, oh, yeah, just look at the figures. The Depression was cured by the U.S. entry into World War II. So some quick problems or observations on that, and this I'm relying on the work of Robert Higgs. So for one thing, with the if you just think about it, yeah, you can of course make the ranks of the unemployed go down if you start drafting men and sending them overseas to get shot at. Mm-hmm. Like that's and as Higgs he does some rough calculations and just shows back of the envelope. That's even on its own terms that was a horrible thing. In other words, like I don't remember the number, but it was like, if you drafted 1 million men, the amount of outstanding unemployment fell by less than 1 million. Okay, so it wasn't even a one-to-one thing. So it was a horribly inefficient way to, quote, solve the unemployment problem. And as far as the GDP numbers, that's just purely an artifact of the fact that when the government spends money on tanks, that gets counted as GDP, even though, methodologically. So I'm not here making a point about foreign policy. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying, in general, if the government spends $1 billion, we have no justification for saying total output went up by 1 billion, because normally the way you say it, if people are voluntarily spending money and you want to somehow amalgamate it into a number, the only thing you can do is add up dollar figures and say, well, so there's problems even there. But if people voluntarily spend $1 billion on cars and some other people spend $1 billion on TVs, there's a sense in which, oh, that's $2 billion worth of output. But if the government takes your money at gunpoint and then distributes it in clearly overvalued contracts to Grumman or something to buy tanks, that's not $1 billion worth of output. It's clearly less because it's not their money. They can't just pocket it and go spend it on other stuff. That would be corruption if the government officials did that. There's kickbacks involved and whatever. So that's a major problem. The last thing I'll point out is, and again, this is due to Robert Higgs's analysis. There's a huge problem with the data. Again, so let me just mention if you do private GDP per capita, that was lower in 1943 and 44 than it was even in 33, right? So again, private sector GDP per capita was lower during the height of the war effort than it was even at the worst depths of the Great Depression, showing that the consumers in the United States were not, they were being starved for goods and services. The reason, though, it probably didn't feel like a bad economy was the privation you could attribute to, oh, well, there's a war on. Like, the reason you don't have nylon stockings, the reason we can't eat any meat this week is because there's a war on. Whereas in 1933, it was clearly, oh, because the economy's broken and the banks are screwed up, you know what I mean? So it was clearly an economic problem, whereas 10 years later, they would just write it off and say, well, don't be so selfish and greedy. Our young men are over there fighting the Germans. Last thing I'll mention is the Fed was creating all kinds of money during this period, and so normally that would cause prices to go up. And so the way you calculate real GDP is you would look at expenditures and then you would adjust it based on some price index. Mm-hmm. But what was happening during the war years, the Fed was still printing money, and so the government was having more dollars with which to buy tanks and stuff, pushing up the spending figures. But there were price controls in effect. So the price indices were legally not allowed to go up. So it was like the numerator was going up, but legally the denominator wasn't allowed to go up. So real GDP seemed to be going up. And I asked Higgs about this, and I said, are you saying they don't adjust for that at all, or are you just saying you don't think they did a good job? He said they didn't adjust for that at all. And so that's just, again, another huge distortion in those numbers. It's completely erroneous to look at those official statistics because, again, a major component is what's the price level to make it, nominal to real, and those were legally prevented from rising.
Yeah, I want to change gears here for a moment. So you wrote the Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism, and a thought that came into my mind last night that I thought would be, I don't know if a devil's advocate's really the right way of looking at it, but it's more just, it's a common thing I've heard a lot around the sphere lately, is I've heard this phrase late stage capitalism. I don't know if you've heard anyone trotting that. Your typical commie will say, well, everything wrong with the country today is a result of late stage capitalism. And so I guess where I want to take that as a question to you is that I feel like, of course, we can't criticize socialism enough. There's no such thing as criticizing socialism enough. But, it's low-hanging fruit for you or I to say, well, if you look at the instances historically where, socialism has been tried, it way more, it's led more often than not to tragedy.
Yeah.
Whereas, even though we certainly don't have a completely wide open free market economy in our country, it's certainly more capitalistic than, the USSR or North Korea. So I guess, so where my devil's advocate question to you is that there are people out there that would say that what you and I would refer to as crony capitalism, cronyism, corruption, late-stage capitalism, whatever term you want to use for it. Our opponents would say that is a natural forthcoming. That's going to happen. That's a natural result of capitalism. That it's going to get to a point where you have this corruption and cronyism, no matter what you do, and so therefore they want to try more socialistic policy because in a fully capitalist society, you're going to inevitably end up with these abuses. What would you say in response to someone that makes the claim that it is inevitable that crony capitalism takes over?
Okay, great. So I think you're right, and sometimes I worry about that too, where whenever some card-carrying communist says, "Oh yeah, I'm not defending what Stalin did or what Mao did or Pol Pot,"
yes.
That's not us, baby. We wouldn't do it like that. We would do it. We'd be compassionate. So you can roll your eyes at those people, but then a lot of times free market people too. When somebody complains about the U.S. and calls it capitalism, they say, "No, it's not capitalism," but yet they will often say like, "Oh, this crazy socialist is using his iPhone. Well, that's a product of capitalism." So it's like, well, hang on, what is it? Was the iPhone better than capitalism or not? Because you can't switch depending on the argument. So I understand where you're coming from. So I guess what I would say is a couple things. So number one, certainly if you want to just say, no, we're not allowed to engage in hypothetical what-if scenarios, you can only look at real-world examples. I would much rather live under the cronyism of the United States or whatever, Great Britain, than under the perverted socialism of North Korea or the USSR or Mao's China. That clearly socialism in practice is horrifying, whereas capitalism in practice, is not. The other thing though is if you push it. Two more points. So another one is to say, using objective measurements of economic freedom, like the indices that places like the Fraser Institute puts out, for example, you can go ahead and rank it and run standard regressions and stuff and see that there is a definite relationship that, it's not like it's the only variable that matters, but for sure, the more economic freedom a place has, other things equal, the better its performance, not just on GDP growth, but all sorts like literacy, childhood mortality, all kinds of things that you could want. And so there's that element as well. So it's not just like it's not just like, oh, wow, if you go, you never go full socialist or something. It's not just that the full bore socialism, but again, even countries that have a low score in economic freedom tend to be worse than vice versa. And then the last thing I would say is, just think about the way the argument typically goes. So if you're arguing with somebody who's more of an interventionist, and you're saying, no, I uphold like laissez-faire, untrammeled capitalism is my ideal, just pure property rights, no government intervention. And then they would say, well, no, that's unrealistic. Typically, what they're what their compromise is to have some form of the welfare state, you know, which is what you and I would call a crony capitalist outcome. So it's sort of like, you know, it doesn't really change the argument any. At worst, all they're saying is we're not going to be able to get to your ideal. But in other words, it's not like there's any danger in rolling back the government and trying to achieve laissez-faire. If what they're saying is, no, we're just going to end up back where we started from 10 years from now because it's politically impossible to stay there. You could say, okay, well, let's have at least 10 years then of a freer economy.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but it's in other words, the worst they're saying is to go down your path, it would not be sustainable, and we would end up back with what I, the interventionist, am recommending we do right now.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, well, maybe let's see if they're right or wrong. But even if they were right, you know, it's not an argument against trying to roll back the size of the state to say we couldn't keep it small. So let's at least do it.
Yeah. So let me say this, and you tell me if this is a good interpretation. So you would make the argument that in quote unquote late stage capitalism, where corruption and cronyism exists, where there's handouts or welfare or whatever, that it is precisely because of socialistic tendencies that the otherwise free market capitalist became more cronyist.
Right, exactly. So that, I mean, one way of looking at it is to say, if the state is powerful enough to intervene and, you know, to overturn property rights and to, you know, pick winners and losers, don't be shocked if the people who end up controlling that process are billionaires, as opposed to, you know, environmental activists or homeless people.
Yeah.
You know, like, so it's if anything, it's the people who advocate a kind, just, loving welfare state with no concern given to the politically powerful and the people who own TV companies. They're the naive ones. You know, we're saying, no, the government shouldn't do it. We have a solid principle to stand on. Whereas, you know, they're the ones that say, oh, no, I want to have this huge regulatory state that can pick winners and losers in business and can hand out billions and billions of dollars to people. But let's just make sure we do it with the right heart and then make sure this system doesn't get corrupted by big money. To me, that's clearly not going to work. Whereas at least we can shoot for an ideal of any time the government's going to do something that violates property rights, we can say, whoop, no, foul, you can't do that.
Now, now, Bob, I don't know about the janky programs that you're on, but around here we have awesome segues from one segment to the next. And so you just mentioned the problem with government picking winners and losers, and that brings us to the next thing I wanted to discuss. You had appeared, or a segment of yours had appeared on Boom Bust on RT, where they were discussing the energy grid in the United States, the energy sector, and sort of this transition that we've had where the Obama administration was really pushing for a lot of subsidies for things like wind and solar, whereas now that Trump is in office, it's the reverse is the case. So those subsidies are trying to go away. They're trying to bring back subsidies for more traditional like coal. And you had made the statement on there of not supporting any of these things, that you really want to point out that in a free market we wouldn't be supporting subsidies for any group, no matter who was in office or what their pet project was. So I want you to take some time to expand on that point greater than what was on that segment, because as I had said before the show, Bob Murphy was criminally underutilized in that segment that they had. So I want you to spend a few moments talking about the energy sector and the problem with government picking winners and losers, no matter who that winner or loser may be.
Sure thing. But for context, for people who didn't see it, I was in there and they got like 10 minutes worth of material out of me, and then when they go to assemble the thing, they only use me for a few moments of it. But
so the lady,
that is the way it happened.
Yeah. So I wanted to say really quick, the lady that was in the piece, she used some of your quotes, but the actual Bob Murphy at the news desk was all of like 15 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah, it was almost a subliminal Murphy.
Yes.
So it was teasing the viewer. They were like, "Whoa, who was that bearded man?" Yeah. Also, just as we're making jokes and stuff, it's fun when you go to YouTube to watch that clip. YouTube helpfully puts at the bottom of the screen, RT is funded in part or in whole by the Russian government. So I haven't checked, but I'm guessing if I went and looked up like a clip from Sesame Street, it wouldn't mention that, by the way, there could be propaganda here because this is a government-funded enterprise. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, there's been a big push to switch over to renewables. People like Paul Krugman. What prompted is I was responding to, I think, a Krugman column where he was saying how, yeah, renewables are just around the corner and we're going to decarbonize in a few decades and it's going to be completely painless, and don't listen to those right-wing crybabies and scaremongers. And it was sort of like, number one, if that's true, then we don't need to have government intervention to force that outcome. Like the government didn't need to put a manure tax on the horse and buggy to get people to switch to automobiles. That just happened naturally with innovation. So we don't need a carbon tax to force people to switch over. If Krugman's telling us, no, wind and solar are, they're more efficient now and they pay for themselves and blah, blah, blah. So there's that element. But also the stuff he was saying, he wasn't putting in a time frame really. And so I was citing just standard projections from like the U.S. government's own energy information agency saying that by 2050, I think the number was something like 78% or so of U.S. electricity was still going to come from fossil fuels. Yeah. And it was only then by that point that coal might have been, coming down, and that renewables would have surpassed its share. So natural gas still was going to be a huge component, and nuclear still for a decent share as well. And so that just reflects the reality that wind and solar are intermittent, right? There's certain areas where, yeah, if the wind blows a lot, it might make sense to throw up some wind turbines there. Go ahead and do it. Certain areas it's real sunny, might make sense to have some solar panels, or if you want to live off the grid out camping somewhere, go ahead and bring a solar thing. But in general, they're not reliable sources, and they can't replace natural gas. And also in terms of transportation too, they're what's called dispatchable. So I mean, you can go anywhere you want and build a plant that's going to just burn coal or natural gas. Or for automobiles, gasoline is a very energy dense form of energy, and it works. And we have the whole infrastructure set up. So even if tomorrow it became cheaper to build a car that used battery power, you still would have the issue of we don't have recharging stations all over the country the way we have gas stations all over. So there's all sorts of things involved. Yeah. And the right response from an economic perspective, I would say, is just have a hands off. Don't pick winners or losers. Don't give special tax treatment one way or the other, or subsidize things, and just let things naturally evolve. And if it does make sense to go for wind and solar, then that would happen naturally.
Yeah. Well, probably on this show in particular, I've definitely had people make the comments to me. A buddy of mine actually was just texting me on the phone right then, and he said, Alan, it seems like you attack the right more than the left, and if I really had to put a label on it, I guess I would say I'm somewhat more right libertarian than left libertarian, but I don't really like labels. But I've heard people complain before that, Alan, you attack the right more. You're harder on conservatives, or you're harder on Republicans than you are on Democrats. And I wanted to take this opportunity to mention that, just because there are a lot of conservatives out there who are diehard voting Republicans because in their mind they see the Republican Party as the party of fiscal conservatism, right? But that's ridiculous. I mean, just on its face, I don't believe that for a second, because we live in a political age where neither party is, in my opinion, is particularly more fiscally conservative than the other. It's really just more that their pet projects will be the ones that get the faucet turned on them, as opposed to the pet projects of the other party or the other administration.
Just for example, I mean, I was in favor of the recent tax reform, and if somebody had come to me and said, hey, here's how much we're going to spend in terms of forfeited revenue, come up with a plan, I wouldn't have just concentrated on reducing the corporate income tax and the other few things they did. I would have tried to do something that was broader based, if for nothing else, in the optics, because it certainly did look like, Republicans come in and give a huge tax cut to rich people, great.
Yeah.
Even though if it's a choice between that or nothing, sure, go ahead and give a tax cut to rich people. It's their money, and they'll probably hire some other people too. Great. Yeah. But then when they followed that up with the huge, military increased spending, it really did just, confirm the accusations of Krugman and others that, I don't believe these guys. They were crying crocodile tears about deficits before, and now they just slash taxes and boost spending. So. To me, that was pretty disappointing. I mean, not that it was surprising.
Yeah.
But, so I could see cutting taxes and having concerns about the deficit taking a backseat, because you could say, well, it's their money, and also, if someone pays for itself in terms of economic growth. But yet to then follow it up with a huge increase in spending really does just show that back. Also, last thing I'll say on this, Republicans who always say, hey, what we need is a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution to, keep these liberals in line, and then they vote to increase the debt ceiling.
Yeah.
And it's like, all you have to do is not increase the debt ceiling, and going forward, we automatically have a balanced budget. But, there they know full well to say, oh, I support a balanced budget amendment. That's not going to happen. So they can pose as big defenders of fiscal integrity, but when they vote to raise the debt ceiling, they're giving away the game. So there's that element too.
Well, I would finish that off by just saying, in my defense, whichever political party is holding the most federal power at that particular moment is probably going to be the ones that I'm hardest on, because they're the ones that are driving the car, so to speak. So I definitely would challenge any of our viewers who are Trump friendly or conservative by nature to reevaluate those beliefs, just because how many days has it been now that we've had a Republican-controlled House, Senate, and presidency, and yet we still have Obamacare? Yeah. We still have a lot of onerous regulation. The swamp is still perfectly full and healthy, even though theoretically, politically, that shouldn't be an issue.
Yeah, I know for myself growing up, I was a child of the 80s, and I was getting into politics back then, and I called myself a conservative. I don't think I ever called myself a Republican, but I was a conservative before I was a libertarian, small c and small l. And so I liked Ronald Reagan, and the excuse always was, well, you got Tip O'Neill and all these, Dan Rostenkowski and these big spending liberal Democrats in Congress. And so then, under George W. Bush finally, in the 2000s, we had everything. And I was like, yay! And then we got Medicare Part D. And then, so it wasn't even just the military spending, even entitlement spending went through the roof. So it just showed, these guys are completely full of it, that, they like to play this game. Elect us because you can't trust those scary Democrats to protect the finances, and the Democrats, of course. Elect us because those Republicans are warmongers and don't care about civil liberties. And you see that, they often commit the worst sins of those respective things because they're the ones who are supposed to be good on that issue.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I want to switch gears one last time before we wrap up for today. So, oh gosh, I really don't like talking about Donald Trump. I really don't. And if you actually just want to say, that's all the time we have for today, that you're more than welcome to do that. But if I had one last thing on my show notes here, is that I wanted you to take some time. We've sort of already touched on it, to let's avoid giving President Trump a grade on foreign policy, because as far as I'm concerned, I'm all for the communications with North Korea and Russia, but the Middle Eastern intervention is still a hard F as far as I'm concerned. But give us your thoughts on your grade so far on the Trump presidency, purely economically and domestically.
It's tricky, so let me at least talk a little bit about it, and because you're right, it's the stuff with trade.
I know that that's a loaded question, because it seems like if there's one thing about the Trump presidency, it's that depending on what day of week it is, you could be violently in a different direction as far as what grade you may give him. So definitely, I want you to expound on that.
And because there's some areas where I think he's really good and other areas where he's awful, and it's kind of hard to know how do you weight those different things. So trade's the most straightforward. Trade, what he's doing, I think, is terrible, and the rhetoric he's using to try to explain what he's doing is also terrible. So the stuff, I think the problem is Trump, to the extent that he actually believes the rhetoric he's saying, I think he views the trade balance as sort of like the income statement of a company. And so I think in his mind, if the United States has a trade deficit, it's like a company that's unprofitable. And that's just wrong. That's just not the right way to think about it. And so I think that's really the issue. I will say, even there, though, fortunately, even guys like Peter Navarro, if I'm saying his name right, they don't come out and say, you know what? Old school mercantilism gets a bad rap, and we're protectionists. That's not what he said. They're saying we believe in free trade. It's just these other countries are cheating and the deck's rigged, and so we're just negotiating to get So even there, even though I disagree with what they're doing and I don't endorse the rhetoric, at least they're giving lip service to the fact that, oh yeah, we're not against free trade per se. We're just, so for what it's worth, there's that element at least. So the tax stuff, he got a bigger cut in a lot of those things than I thought was going to be politically possible. So again, I wouldn't have designed it that way given the parameters, but I was surprised at what they pushed through. For one thing, just the size of the net tax cut, number one, but also they did reform it in ways that a lot of people thought weren't going to be possible. So that's interesting. Also, something on that I don't hear many people talking about. You mentioned the Affordable Care or Obamacare, at least getting rid of the penalty for not having insurance.
Yes.
That's a huge thing, and nobody talks about one way or the other. It's interesting. So there's that element. What else was there? Oh, as far as regulatory reform, though, in my area of energy policy, I will say the Trump administration has been surprising. So I'm not defending, the personal stuff that Pruitt was doing, all those kinds of those scandal things. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I'm not. I don't know why he did that. They're stupid. But as far as the policies coming out, I mean, there are people getting appointed that I know some of these guys who are really good on free market energy policy, and I would have, if you had asked me 3 years ago, would some of these people be working in the government, I would say, oh no, they're much too pure, they're much too good on these issues to be politically viable, and yet they were getting appointed. So I would say, at least on that narrow element, as far as reforming energy policy, I think he did live up to the hopes of free market people who said, hey, this guy's different, and maybe he'll get in there, and since he's not a politician, maybe he'll do something. That's one area where I am very pleasantly surprised at the stuff he was doing. So I guess last thing, like we mentioned a minute ago, I wish he had said to the Congress, I'm not going to sign off on huge spending increases. Mm-hmm. This is crazy. We're bleeding money like crazy. We're up to our eyeballs in red ink. No, we got to hold the line on spending. I'll give you a 2% increase on that or whatever. Mm-hmm. If he even, but. To me, I didn't even see him pick a fight on that issue, which I don't know why. He could have easily done that. People would have rallied to him. Yeah.
Well, so I'm gonna interpret, instead of giving a letter grade, I'm gonna interpret that as cautious optimism. But ask me again next week.
Sounds like a C.
Yeah. Last thing I should say is to me, the Fed is the one that set the U.S. up for a big crash. Mm-hmm. So I do think the economy is in trouble going forward, but I think that would have happened no matter what the Trump administration's fiscal or regulatory policies were. So, if we have a crash next Thursday, I don't want people saying, you didn't see that, Murphy. I've been worried about the Fed's QE program setting us up for a crash.
Well, we're going to have you back on the show in the future to discuss the Fed specifically, because I was going into my planning for this episode and I thought, if we touch on the Fed, that's the whole episode.
Yeah. Sure, yeah.
So I've tried my best to avoid. I mean, you can't avoid it, right? But I've tried my best to avoid it because I know that's a series of episodes worth of information. But for everybody at home, the politically incorrect guide to capitalism, politically incorrect guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal, and choice, cooperation, enterprise, and human action, which I know you can find on your website as well as Amazon, which is consultingbyRPM.com. Am I leaving anything out, Bob, or are we good?
Last thing let me just mention, it just occurred to me, when you asked about common misconceptions about the Great Depression, one of them is that the gold standard caused the Great Depression. No, it didn't. We had the gold standard for a long time before. That's a bad explanation on the face of it. And get my book to find out more.
Yeah, well, they definitely should, and I want to mention this really quick too, since you brought that up. Our program is called The Gold Standard with Alan Mosley. Mm-hmm. We have never discussed the gold standard on The Gold Standard with Alan Mosley, so maybe we'll do that someday.
Have you ever had an episode devoted to Alan Mosley? I think people would want to know more.
Probably the first 30 seconds of episode 1, but the ratings didn't do so hot, so we moved on. Didn't do so good. Moved on. Bob, thank you so much for being with us. I want to get you out on this one, and then we'll do our goodbyes. This is the libertarian question I think is on everyone's minds. Do you classify a hot dog as a sandwich?
Huh. No, I personally don't. But
Wow.
I would not boot someone out of the movement, out of the liberty movement, if they were to disagree with me.
So I think the first time that Bob has been speechless is on that. I mean, that's really what this episode was all about.
It's all about that.
Bob Murphy, thank you so
Thank
much
you,
for
sir.
being on the show. I can't thank you enough for spending the time with us today.
Definitely.
Okay, thanks for having me, guys.
And you know what we didn't do at the start of the episode?
I was thinking about that. You kind of forgot.
Well, you're supposed to. What do you even do here? You're supposed to remind me.
I push buttons.
You do. You
That's
do.
all I do.
You're really good at that.
Yeah,
you're really good at pushing.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
I push your buttons.
Yes. So if you want to follow us on Facebook, it's facebook.com/TGS Alan Mosley. Twitter is @Alan M Mosley. And really, you don't have to do any of that because you could just go to our website, which is thegoldstandardpodcast.com. And maybe next week we'll actually say that at the start of the
Yeah.
but
Why not?
but not this week.
Not this week.
Thank you so much for being with us, guys. See us next week.